The autumn light filtering through the tall windows of the Harvard University archives cast long shadows across Dr. Amanda Richardson's desk as she carefully opened the manila envelope that had arrived that morning. Inside was a daguerreotype that would challenge everything she thought she knew about 19th century photography and the boundaries between the living and the dead. The sender, a Mrs. Catherine Whitmore of Salem, Massachusetts, had included a brief note explaining that the photograph had been discovered in her late aunt's attic, wrapped in black cloth and hidden inside a cedar chest that hadn't been opened in decades. Dr. Richardson, a specialist in Victorian-era photography and visual culture, received dozens of similar submissions each year from families hoping to learn more about their ancestral photographs. Most were routine examples of period portraiture that could be easily dated and contextualized within the broader history of American photography. However, the image she was about to examine would prove to be anything but routine. The daguerreotype, measuring approximately 6 by 8 inches, showed a family of 5 arranged in the formal style typical of 1890s studio photography. A stern-faced patriarch in a dark suit stood behind a seated woman holding an infant, while 2 children, perhaps 8 and 10 years old, flanked them on either side. The composition was conventional, the lighting professional, and the quality of the image exceptional for its age. Yet something about the photograph immediately struck Dr. Richardson as unsettling, though she couldn't initially identify what had triggered her unease. As she positioned the daguerreotype under her magnifying glass for closer examination, Dr. Richardson noticed details that seemed inconsistent with the photograph's apparent date and circumstances. The family members all maintained the rigid, formal poses expected of Victorian portraiture, but their expressions held a quality of tension that went beyond the typical discomfort of long exposure times. The children, in particular, appeared to be staring not at the camera, but at something positioned slightly to the left of the photographer's position. The technical quality of the image was remarkable, with crisp detail and excellent contrast that suggested the work of a skilled professional photographer. However, certain elements of the composition seemed unusual for the period. The lighting appeared to come from multiple sources, rather than the single strong light typically used in 1890s studio work, creating subtle shadows and highlights that gave the image an almost three-dimensional quality. It was while examining the background details that Dr. Richardson made her first disturbing discovery. In the far left corner of the photograph, barely visible in the shadows behind the posed family, was what appeared to be the figure of an elderly woman. The figure was so faint and indistinct that it could easily be dismissed as a photographic artifact or play of light and shadow, except for one unmistakable detail. The woman appeared to be wearing period clothing from several decades earlier than the rest of the family. Dr. Richardson adjusted her magnification and examined the mysterious figure more closely. The elderly woman was positioned as if she were standing behind and slightly to the side of the family group, though her image was translucent and ethereal compared to the solid presence of the other figures. Her clothing appeared to be from the 1860s or early 1870s, suggesting she represented an earlier generation than the family members who were clearly the intended subjects of the photograph. The discovery prompted Dr. Richardson to contact Mrs. Whitmore to learn more about the photograph's history and the family it depicted. Mrs. Whitmore explained that the image showed her great-great-grandparents, the Thornfield family, who had lived in a large Victorian house in Salem during the 1890s. The photograph had been taken in 1894, according to family records, to commemorate the birth of the youngest child. However, Mrs. Whitmore's account included details that made the mysterious figure in the background even more intriguing. According to family tradition, the elderly woman visible in the corner of the photograph was Sarah Thornfield, the family matriarch who had died in 1889, 5 years before the portrait was taken. Family members had long claimed that Sarah's spirit continued to watch over the household following her death, though Mrs. Whitmore had always assumed these stories were typical Victorian superstitions about the deceased. The identification of the mysterious figure as Sarah Thornfield raised immediate questions about how her image could have appeared in a photograph taken years after her death. Dr. Richardson was familiar with various photographic techniques that could create ghostly effects, including double exposure and spirit photography, but the quality and integration of the figure suggested something more sophisticated than the crude manipulation typical of Victorian spirit photographs. Dr. Richardson decided to conduct a thorough technical analysis of the daguerreotype to determine whether the mysterious figure was the result of photographic manipulation or some other phenomenon. She arranged for the image to be examined using advanced digital enhancement techniques that could reveal details invisible to conventional examination. The results of this analysis would prove more disturbing than anything she had anticipated. The digital enhancement revealed that the figure of Sarah Thornfield was not a later addition to the photograph, but appeared to have been captured during the original exposure. The lighting and shadow patterns affecting her image were consistent with the rest of the photograph, and there were no signs of the double exposure lines or compositional inconsistencies that would indicate photographic manipulation. Most remarkably, the enhancement revealed additional details of Sarah's appearance that had been invisible under normal examination. The enhanced image showed Sarah Thornfield with startling clarity, revealing facial features and clothing details that matched descriptions found in family documents from the 1870s. Her expression was one of benevolent watchfulness, as if she were overseeing the family gathering from beyond the grave. However, the most disturbing aspect of the enhanced image was the discovery that Sarah appeared to be reaching toward the infant in the family portrait, her translucent hand extended as if in blessing or claim. Dr. Richardson's analysis also revealed other anomalies in the photograph that had not been visible during initial examination. The shadows cast by the living family members showed subtle inconsistencies that suggested the presence of additional figures beyond those clearly visible in the image. Most unsettling was the discovery that the children in the photograph appeared to be looking directly at Sarah Thornfield's position, confirming that they had been aware of her presence during the photographic session. The implications of these discoveries prompted Dr. Richardson to research the Thornfield family history more thoroughly, hoping to understand the circumstances that might have led to Sarah's apparent manifestation in the family portrait. Her investigation revealed a complex family saga, marked by tragedy, devotion, and what appeared to be genuine supernatural phenomena that had affected multiple generations. Sarah Thornfield had been the founding matriarch of the family fortune, having arrived in Salem as a young bride in 1845 and gradually building a successful textile business with her husband, Jonathan Thornfield. According to historical records, Sarah had been a formidable woman who had maintained strict control over her family's affairs and had been deeply devoted to ensuring the welfare and success of her descendants. Her death in 1889 had been sudden and unexpected, occurring just as the family was experiencing significant financial difficulties that threatened their established position in Salem society. The family documents that Mrs. Whitmore provided revealed that Sarah's death had been followed by a remarkable reversal of the Thornfield family's fortunes. Within months of her passing, new business opportunities had emerged that restored their financial stability, and various legal difficulties that had threatened the family had been mysteriously resolved. Family members had attributed these positive developments to Sarah's continuing influence from beyond the grave, claiming that her spirit was actively working to protect her descendants. However, the family records also documented disturbing incidents that had occurred in the Thornfield household following Sarah's death. Servants reported encountering an elderly woman in old-fashioned clothing walking through the halls at night, and family members described hearing Sarah's voice offering advice and warnings about various family matters. Most significantly, the family's infant children seemed to be particularly affected by Sarah's presence, often reaching toward empty spaces and giggling as if playing with an invisible companion. The 1894 family portrait had been commissioned during a period when Sarah's manifestations had become more frequent and pronounced. According to the family records, Sarah had begun appearing at family gatherings and important occasions, always positioned as if she were watching over her descendants with protective concern. The photographer hired for the portrait session, a professional named Marcus Webb, had initially been skeptical of the family's claims about supernatural manifestations, but had reportedly become a believer after witnessing inexplicable phenomena during the sitting. Dr. Richardson located Marcus Webb's business records in the Salem Historical Society archives, hoping to find additional information about the unusual photographic session. Webb's detailed notes about the Thornfield portrait described one of the most extraordinary experiences of his professional career. According to his account, the photographic session had been interrupted multiple times by temperature drops, unexplained sounds, and what he described as the sense of being watched by an unseen presence. Most remarkably, Webb's notes indicated that he had been aware of Sarah Thornfield's presence during the photographic exposure, but had been unable to see her with his naked eye. He described feeling compelled to adjust his camera angle and lighting to accommodate what he sensed was an additional figure in the composition, though he could not explain the source of this compulsion. The resulting photograph had captured Sarah's image with a clarity that astounded Webb, who had never before achieved such detailed documentation of what he came to believe was genuine spiritual manifestation. Webb's notes also revealed that the Thornfield portrait was not the only photograph he had taken that captured unexplained figures. Over the course of his career, he had documented several other cases where deceased family members appeared in portraits of their living relatives, always under circumstances that suggested genuine supernatural presence rather than photographic trickery. However, Webb had kept these discoveries private, fearing that public knowledge of his supernatural photographs would damage his professional reputation. The discovery of Marcus Webb's other supernatural photographs led Dr. Richardson to research whether similar phenomena had been documented by other photographers of the period. Her investigation revealed a hidden tradition of legitimate spirit photography that existed alongside the more famous, fraudulent examples that had been exposed and debunked by skeptical investigators. A small number of professional photographers had reportedly captured genuine supernatural manifestations, though most had chosen to keep their discoveries secret rather than risk ridicule or accusation of fraud. Dr. Richardson's research led her to contact other archives and historical societies throughout New England, seeking additional examples of authenticated spirit photographs from the 1890s. Her efforts yielded several remarkable discoveries, including photographs held by private families who had never shared them publicly due to their supernatural content. These images showed consistent patterns that suggested genuine spiritual phenomena rather than photographic manipulation or deliberate fraud. The authenticated spirit photographs shared several characteristics that distinguished them from known fraudulent examples. The spiritual figures appeared to be integrated naturally into the original photographic composition, with lighting and shadow patterns that matched the rest of the image. The spirits typically appeared as translucent or ethereal figures, positioned as observers or protectors of their living family members. Most significantly, the photographs had been taken by reputable professional photographers who had documented the unusual circumstances surrounding their creation. One particularly compelling example was discovered in the archives of the Peabody Essex Museum, where a family portrait from 1892 showed a deceased grandfather appearing behind his living descendants during what was supposed to be a routine family photograph. The photographer's notes, preserved with the image, described sensing an additional presence during the exposure and adjusting his technique to accommodate what he felt was an invisible participant in the family gathering. The accumulation of similar cases from the 1890s suggested that the period had been marked by an unusual frequency of genuine spiritual manifestations in family photographs. Dr. Richardson theorized that this phenomenon might have been related to the specific cultural and technological conditions of the era, when traditional beliefs about death and the afterlife intersected with the new technology of photography in ways that created unique opportunities for supernatural documentation. The late 19th century was a period when many families were experiencing rapid social and economic changes that disrupted traditional patterns of family life and community support. The death of family patriarchs and matriarchs often left succeeding generations struggling to maintain their established positions, creating conditions of stress and uncertainty that might have facilitated supernatural intervention by deceased family members who remained emotionally connected to their descendants' welfare. At the same time, the technology of photography was reaching new levels of sensitivity and sophistication that might have allowed cameras to capture phenomena that were invisible or barely perceptible to human observers. The long exposure times required for daguerreotype and early photographic processes created opportunities for spiritual presences to gradually manifest during the photographic session, accumulating visibility over the extended period required for image formation. Dr. Richardson's research into the cultural context of 1890s spirit photography revealed that the phenomenon had been most common in families experiencing significant transitions or challenges that might have attracted the protective attention of deceased relatives. Financial difficulties, illness, family disputes, and other forms of instability seemed to create conditions that facilitated supernatural manifestation, as if the emotional distress of living family members provided a mechanism through which deceased relatives could return to offer guidance and support. The Thornfield family's experience fit this pattern precisely, with Sarah's manifestation coinciding with the family's financial crisis and her apparent intervention leading to the resolution of their difficulties. Other documented cases showed similar correlations between family stress and spiritual manifestation, suggesting that the phenomenon served a genuine protective function rather than merely representing random supernatural activity. However, Dr. Richardson's research also revealed that spiritual manifestation in family photographs was not always benevolent. Several cases from the 1890s documented appearances by deceased family members whose presence seemed to bring misfortune rather than protection to their living relatives. These malevolent manifestations were typically associated with individuals who had died under traumatic circumstances or who had harbored resentments against their families during their lifetimes. One particularly disturbing case involved a family portrait from 1895 that showed the spirit of a deceased uncle whose presence in the photograph had coincided with a series of mysterious accidents and illnesses that affected the family for months afterward. The photographer who had taken the image reported sensing a hostile presence during the session and had initially refused to deliver the finished photograph due to his concerns about its potential effects on the family. The documentation of both benevolent and malevolent spiritual manifestations in family photographs suggested that the phenomenon represented genuine supernatural activity rather than psychological projection or wishful thinking on the part of grieving families. The consistency of the photographic evidence across multiple cases and photographers indicated that 1890s spirit photography had captured authentic interactions between the living and the dead that challenged conventional understanding of mortality and consciousness. Dr. Richardson's analysis of the Thornfield family portrait confirmed that Sarah's manifestation belonged to the benevolent category of spiritual appearances. The technical quality of her image, her protective positioning relative to the family, and the positive outcomes that had followed her death all suggested that her spirit had returned to fulfill her maternal obligations to ensure her descendants' welfare. The photograph served as tangible evidence of her continuing influence over the family's affairs and her ability to intervene in the physical world on their behalf. However, the discovery also raised troubling questions about the nature of death and the possibility that consciousness might survive physical existence in forms that could interact with the living world. If the Thornfield photograph and similar images truly documented supernatural manifestations, they challenged fundamental assumptions about the finality of death and the separation between the physical and spiritual realms. Dr. Richardson found herself in the unprecedented position of possessing what appeared to be scientific evidence of life after death, documented through a medium that was generally accepted as reliable and objective. The implications of this discovery extended far beyond the realm of historical photography, to touch on basic questions about the nature of human existence and the possibility of survival beyond physical death. The weight of these implications prompted Dr. Richardson to seek consultation with colleagues in other disciplines who might provide perspective on the philosophical and theological significance of the documented spiritual manifestations. She contacted Dr. Robert Hayes, a philosopher specializing in consciousness studies, and Dr. Maria Santos, a theologian with expertise in comparative religions and afterlife beliefs. Dr. Hayes was intrigued by the photographic evidence, but cautioned against drawing definitive conclusions about the nature of consciousness based on what might be anomalous photographic phenomena. He suggested that the images might represent previously unknown aspects of human perception or memory that could create apparent manifestations without necessarily implying survival of consciousness after death. However, He acknowledged that the consistency and quality of the documented manifestations challenged conventional materialist explanations of consciousness and perception. Dr. Santos approached the photographs from the perspective of comparative religious studies, noting that spiritual manifestation in visual media had been reported across cultures and historical periods. She pointed out that the documented cases from the 1890s were consistent with religious traditions that maintained the possibility of continued existence and intervention by deceased family members. However, she also cautioned that religious belief and genuine supernatural phenomena were not necessarily identical, and that careful analysis was required to distinguish between cultural expectation and authentic spiritual activity. The consultations with experts in philosophy and theology provided valuable perspective on the broader implications of the spirit photography discoveries, but they did not resolve the fundamental question of whether the documented manifestations represented genuine supernatural phenomena or previously unknown aspects of natural processes. Dr. Richardson realized that definitive answers might be impossible to achieve using conventional academic methods, but that the evidence deserved serious consideration regardless of its ultimate explanation. The authenticity of the Thornfield family portrait and similar images was further supported by Dr. Richardson's discovery of additional documentation that corroborated the supernatural experiences reported by the families involved. She located personal letters, diary entries, and other contemporary accounts that described the same spiritual manifestations that appeared in the photographs, providing independent confirmation of the phenomena from multiple witnesses. The Thornfield family's private papers, preserved in Mrs. Whitmore's possession, included detailed accounts of Sarah's continuing presence in the household following her death. These documents described specific incidents where Sarah's spirit had provided guidance, warnings, and assistance to family members facing various challenges. The accounts were written by multiple family members over several years, creating a consistent narrative of supernatural intervention that corroborated the photographic evidence. Most convincingly, the family papers included predictions and advice attributed to Sarah's spirit that had subsequently proven accurate and beneficial to the family's welfare. These included warnings about business investments that would have resulted in financial loss, advice about family relationships that helped resolve potentially damaging conflicts, and guidance about educational and career decisions that led to positive outcomes for family members. The practical value of Sarah's supernatural interventions provided strong evidence that her manifestations represented genuine communication rather than wishful thinking or coincidence. Similar documentation was found for other families whose spirit photographs had been authenticated, creating a pattern of evidence that supported the reality of supernatural manifestation in multiple cases. The consistency of these accounts across different families and time periods suggested that spiritual intervention in family affairs might have been more common during the 1890s than previously recognized by historians. Dr. Richardson's investigation into the broader cultural context of 1890s spiritualism revealed that the documented cases of authentic spirit photography occurred within a society that was experiencing rapid technological and social change that might have created unique conditions for supernatural manifestation. The introduction of electric lighting, telephone communication, and other new technologies had created an environment where the boundaries between the natural and supernatural seemed more permeable than in previous generations. The period was also marked by significant disruption of traditional family structures and community relationships, as urbanization and industrialization changed the patterns of American life. The death of family elders often left succeeding generations without the guidance and support that had previously been provided through extended family networks, creating emotional and practical needs that might have facilitated supernatural intervention by deceased relatives. Dr. Richardson theorized that the combination of technological innovation and social disruption during the 1890s had created a unique historical moment when spiritual manifestation became temporarily more accessible and visible to living observers. The development of photography during this period had provided a medium through which these manifestations could be documented and preserved, creating a record of supernatural activity that would otherwise have been lost to history. However, Dr. Richardson's research also revealed that authentic spirit photography had declined dramatically after 1900, with very few documented cases occurring during the 20th century. This pattern suggested that the phenomenon had been specific to the cultural and technological conditions of the 1890s, rather than representing a permanent aspect of human experience that could be replicated under different circumstances. The decline of authentic spirit photography after 1900 coincided with increasing skepticism about supernatural phenomena and the exposure of numerous fraudulent spirit photographers who had capitalized on public interest in communication with the dead. The revelation that many supposed spirit photographs were deliberate hoaxes had damaged public confidence in all supernatural photography, making it difficult for legitimate cases to receive serious consideration. At the same time, improvements in photographic technology and techniques had made it easier to detect manipulation and fraud, while also reducing the long exposure times that might have been necessary for genuine spiritual manifestation to occur. The shorter exposure times and more controlled lighting conditions used in 20th century photography might have eliminated the specific technical requirements that had allowed spirits to manifest visibly during the 1890s. Dr. Richardson's final analysis of the Thornfield family portrait and related cases concluded that the 1890s had represented a unique period in human history when technological and cultural conditions had temporarily made spiritual manifestation visible and documentable through photography. The authentic spirit photographs from this period provided unprecedented evidence of consciousness survival and supernatural intervention that challenged conventional understanding of death and the afterlife. However, Dr. Richardson also recognized that the historical specificity of the phenomenon meant that it could not be replicated or studied using contemporary methods. The 1890s spirit photographs remained as isolated examples of supernatural documentation that could inform understanding of human consciousness and mortality, but could not provide definitive proof of survival after death that would satisfy modern scientific standards. The Thornfield family portrait returned to Mrs. Whitmore's possession, accompanied by Dr. Richardson's detailed analysis and authentication of its supernatural content. Mrs. Whitmore reported that learning about Sarah's protective presence in the photograph had provided comfort and reassurance about her family's spiritual heritage, confirming stories that had been passed down through generations but had never before been supported by tangible evidence. Dr. Richardson's research into 1890 spirit photography was published in a specialized academic journal, where it generated significant interest among historians of photography and scholars of religious studies. While the supernatural aspects of the documented cases remained controversial, the quality of the photographic evidence and supporting documentation established the authenticity of the manifestations and their historical significance. The investigation had revealed that the boundary between the natural and supernatural might be more permeable than generally acknowledged, particularly during periods of rapid technological and social change that disrupted traditional patterns of human experience. The 1890 spirit photographs stood as testament to the possibility that consciousness might survive physical death in forms that could occasionally interact with the living world under specific circumstances. For Dr. Richardson, the Thornfield family portrait remained a profound reminder of the mysteries that continued to exist within human experience despite advances in scientific understanding. However, her research was about to take an unexpected turn when she received a phone call from Mrs. Whitmore that would reveal the true extent of Sarah Thornfield's continuing influence over her family's affairs. Mrs. Whitmore's voice trembled with excitement and concern as she explained that the authentication of the spirit photograph had triggered a series of unusual events in her own home. Since learning about Sarah's presence in the family portrait, Mrs. Whitmore had begun experiencing what she could only describe as visitations from her ancestral grandmother, despite the fact that Sarah had died more than a century before Mrs. Whitmore's birth. The manifestations had begun subtly, with Mrs. Whitmore noticing the scent of lavender water, Sarah's preferred perfume according to family records, appearing in various rooms of her house without apparent source. This had been followed by the discovery of objects moved from their usual positions, always arranged in ways that seemed purposeful rather than random. Most remarkably, Mrs. Whitmore had found old family photographs arranged on her kitchen table in chronological order, creating a visual timeline of the Thornfield family history that she had never assembled herself. Dr. Richardson was initially skeptical of Mrs. Whitmore's claims, suspecting that learning about the spirit photograph might have triggered psychological reactions that could manifest as perceived supernatural experiences. However, Mrs. Whitmore's descriptions were detailed and consistent, and she had documented many of the incidents with photographs and written records that provided tangible evidence of the unusual occurrences. Most compelling was Mrs. Whitmore's report that she had begun receiving what appeared to be guidance from Sarah's spirit regarding family matters that Mrs. Whitmore had never discussed with anyone else. This guidance had proven remarkably accurate and beneficial, helping Mrs. Whitmore resolve long-standing family disputes and make important decisions about her children's education and career paths. The practical value of this supernatural advice echoed the historical accounts of Sarah's beneficial interventions with previous generations of the family. Dr. Richardson decided to visit Mrs. Whitmore's home to observe the reported phenomena firsthand and to conduct additional research into the Thornfield family history that might explain the apparent reactivation of Sarah's spiritual presence. The visit would provide insights into the continuing influence of authenticated spirit photographs and their potential to facilitate ongoing supernatural communication between the living and the dead. Mrs. Whitmore's house, a modest colonial revival structure built in the 1920s, showed no obvious signs of supernatural activity during Dr. Richardson's initial visit. However, as the two women examined the original spirit photograph together, both reported sensing a distinct change in the atmosphere of the room. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees, and both women experienced the unmistakable feeling of being observed by an unseen presence. While they were discussing the technical aspects of the photograph's creation, Mrs. Whitmore suddenly pointed to an empty corner of the room and asked if Dr. Richardson could see the elderly woman standing there. Dr. Richardson saw nothing unusual, but Mrs. Whitmore provided a detailed description of Sarah Thornfield that matched both the spirit photograph and historical descriptions found in family documents. According to Mrs. Whitmore, Sarah appeared to be nodding approvingly as they discussed the authentication of her photographic manifestation. The incident convinced Dr. Richardson that Mrs. Whitmore was experiencing genuine phenomena rather than psychological suggestion or wishful thinking. The specificity of Mrs. Whitmore's descriptions and her ability to provide details about Sarah's appearance that matched historical records suggested that she was perceiving authentic supernatural manifestations rather than projecting her own expectations based on the spirit photograph. Dr. Richardson arranged to conduct extended observations at Mrs. Whitmore's house, hoping to document any supernatural phenomena that occurred and to understand the mechanisms through which the spirit photograph might be facilitating ongoing communication with Sarah's spirit. The research would provide unprecedented opportunity to study active spiritual manifestation in a controlled environment where the historical context and family connections were well documented. Over the course of several weeks, Dr. Richardson documented numerous incidents that appeared to confirm the reality of Sarah's continuing presence in Mrs. Whitmore's household. These included physical manifestations, such as doors opening and closing without apparent cause, objects appearing in locations where they had not been placed, and electronic devices activating without human intervention. More significantly, Dr. Richardson observed Mrs. Whitmore receiving specific information about family history and genealogy that proved accurate when verified against historical records, despite Mrs. Whitmore having no prior knowledge of these details. The most remarkable incident occurred during Dr. Richardson's third week of observation, when Mrs. Whitmore announced that Sarah had provided information about the location of additional family documents that had been missing for decades. Following directions that Mrs. Whitmore claimed to have received from Sarah's spirit, they searched the basement of Mrs. Whitmore's elderly neighbor, a distant Thornfield relative, and discovered a trunk containing letters, photographs, and business records that had belonged to Sarah during her lifetime. The recovered documents provided extraordinary insights into Sarah Thornfield's personality and methods of family management. that explained her continuing influence over successive generations. The papers revealed that Sarah had maintained detailed records of her family's financial affairs, social connections, and personal relationships, along with specific instructions for how family members should handle various challenges and opportunities. Her level of detailed planning and concern for her descendants' welfare suggested a personality that would indeed persist beyond death to ensure that her guidance continued to benefit the family. Most significantly, the recovered documents included Sarah's own account of her beliefs about death and the afterlife, written shortly before her passing in 1889. These writings revealed that Sarah had deliberately prepared for her own death in ways designed to maintain her connection with the living world and her ability to influence family affairs. She had studied spiritualist literature extensively and had consulted with mediums and other practitioners who claimed knowledge of techniques for maintaining conscious existence beyond physical death. Sarah's writings described her intention to remain available to guide and protect her family through what she expected would be a transitional period following her death. She had made specific arrangements for family members to maintain connection with her spirit through meditation, prayer, and attention to signs and omens that would indicate her continued presence. The 1894 spirit photograph appeared to have been part of this larger plan to document and legitimize her supernatural interventions on behalf of her descendants. The discovery of Sarah's deliberate preparation for posthumous family guidance provided a rational framework for understanding the centuries-long pattern of supernatural manifestations that had affected the Thornfield family. Rather than representing random spiritual activity, Sarah's manifestations appeared to be the result of conscious planning and preparation that had enabled her to maintain purposeful influence over family affairs despite the barrier of death. Dr. Richardson's research into spiritualist literature from the 1880s revealed that Sarah's approach to preparing for death was consistent with practices recommended by prominent spiritualist teachers of the period. These teachers claimed that individuals who died with strong emotional attachments to living relatives could maintain conscious existence in spiritual form if they prepared properly and if their families remained receptive to supernatural communication. The spiritualist techniques described in the literature included meditation practices designed to strengthen the connection between conscious will and spiritual energy, along with specific instructions for maintaining awareness and purposeful action after the death of the physical body. Practitioners were encouraged to identify specific family members who would be most receptive to spiritual communication and to establish clear methods for providing guidance and assistance from beyond the grave. Sarah's writings indicated that she had followed these spiritualist practices extensively during the months before her death, working with local mediums to develop her ability to maintain conscious existence in spiritual form. She had also identified specific family members in each generation who would serve as primary contacts for her supernatural guidance, ensuring that her influence would continue to benefit the family through changing circumstances and successive generations. The systematic nature of Sarah's preparation for posthumous family guidance distinguished her manifestations from typical reports of spiritual activity, which were usually described as random or emotionally driven phenomena. Sarah's spirit appeared to operate according to deliberate plans and priorities that reflected her personality and values during life, suggesting that consciousness survival might be possible for individuals who possessed sufficient knowledge and determination to maintain their identity beyond physical death. Dr. Richardson's documentation of Sarah's continuing influence over the Thornfield family provided unprecedented evidence for the survival of consciousness beyond death and the possibility of purposeful interaction between spiritual and physical realms. The combination of historical documentation, photographic evidence, and contemporary manifestations created a comprehensive case study that challenged conventional understanding of mortality and consciousness. However, the research also revealed potential dangers associated with maintaining active spiritual connections across generations. Mrs. Whitmore reported that Sarah's guidance, while generally beneficial, had become increasingly demanding and controlling over time. The spirit seemed to expect immediate compliance with her suggestions and became agitated when family members pursued courses of action that differed from her recommendations. More troubling was Mrs. Cow Whitmore's observation that Sarah's manifestations had begun affecting other family members who had not requested spiritual contact. Mrs. Whitmore's adult children reported experiencing unsolicited dreams and visions featuring Sarah, along with compulsions to make decisions that aligned with what they perceived to be Sarah's wishes. These experiences had created family tensions and raised questions about the ethics of supernatural intervention in the lives of individuals who had not consented to spiritual guidance. The escalation of Sarah's spiritual activity prompted Dr. Richardson to research methods for managing or limiting supernatural manifestations that had become problematic. Her investigation led her to contact contemporary practitioners of spiritualist traditions who claimed expertise in communicating with persistent spirits and establishing appropriate boundaries for supernatural interaction. Dr. Margaret Blackwood, a medium and spiritualist counselor based in Salem, agreed to evaluate the situation at Mrs. Whitmore's house and to provide guidance about managing Sarah's increasingly intrusive spiritual presence. Dr. Blackwood's assessment confirmed that Sarah's spirit remained actively present in the household and was indeed exerting significant influence over family members' thoughts and decisions. According to Dr. Blackwood, Sarah's spirit exhibited characteristics typical of what spiritualist tradition called earthbound souls, deceased individuals who maintained such strong attachments to worldly affairs that they resisted moving on to whatever spiritual realm awaited them beyond physical existence. While these spirits often provided valuable assistance to their living relatives, they could also become controlling and possessive in ways that ultimately harmed the people they sought to help. Dr. Blackwood explained that managing earthbound spirits required establishing clear boundaries through respectful but firm communication that acknowledged their beneficial intentions while limiting their ability to interfere with the autonomous decisions of living family members. The process involved both spiritual techniques for communicating with the deceased and practical measures to reduce the environmental conditions that facilitated supernatural manifestation. Working with Mrs. Whitmore and other Thornfield family members, Dr. Blackwood conducted a series of séance sessions designed to communicate directly with Sarah's spirit and to negotiate appropriate limits for her ongoing involvement in family affairs. These sessions revealed that Sarah remained deeply concerned about her descendants' welfare and was reluctant to reduce her protective activities, but that she could be persuaded to respect family members' autonomy if she was assured that her guidance would still be welcome when specifically requested. The séance communications also revealed additional information about Sarah's techniques for maintaining spiritual existence and her methods for influencing physical events from beyond the grave. According to her own account, Sarah had learned to manipulate electromagnetic fields and environmental energies in ways that allowed her to affect electronic devices, move physical objects, and influence the thoughts and emotions of living individuals who were psychologically receptive to spiritual contact. Sarah's descriptions of her supernatural abilities provided insights into the mechanisms that might underlie genuine spiritual manifestation, suggesting that consciousness survival involved maintaining coherent patterns of energy that could interact with physical systems under appropriate conditions. While these explanations remained beyond current scientific understanding, they offered theoretical frameworks that might eventually allow for empirical study of consciousness survival and spiritual manifestation. The successful negotiation of boundaries with Sarah's spirit resulted in a significant reduction in unsolicited supernatural activity, while maintaining the family's access to her guidance when specifically requested. Mrs. Whitmore reported that the household atmosphere became more peaceful and that family members felt less pressured to conform to Sarah's expectations, while still benefiting from her wisdom and protective concern when they chose to seek her advice. Dr. Richardson's documentation of the boundary negotiation process provided valuable insights into methods for managing problematic spiritual manifestations while preserving beneficial aspects of supernatural communication. The case demonstrated that conscious spirits might be capable of rational discussion and compromise, suggesting that post-mortem consciousness retained personality characteristics and moral reasoning abilities that had existed during physical life. The Thornfield case study was eventually published in a specialized journal that focused on consciousness research and survival studies, where it generated significant interest among researchers investigating the possibility of consciousness survival beyond death. While the supernatural aspects of the case remained controversial within mainstream academic circles, the quality of documentation and the consistency of observed phenomena established the case as an important contribution to the literature on apparent survival evidence. Dr. Richardson's research methodology, which combined historical investigation, technical analysis, and systematic observation of contemporary manifestations, provided a model for future studies of similar phenomena. The case demonstrated that serious academic investigation of supernatural claims was possible when appropriate controls and documentation procedures were employed, and that such research could yield valuable insights into the nature of consciousness and its relationship to physical existence. The Thornfield family portrait continued to serve as the central piece of evidence for Sarah's consciousness survival, providing tangible documentation of her ability to manifest visibly during the 1890s. However, the contemporary manifestations observed by Dr. Richardson suggested that Sarah's spiritual presence had continued to evolve and develop over the decades since her death, adapting to changing family circumstances while maintaining her core identity and protective motivations. The case raised profound questions about the nature of personal identity and its relationship to physical existence, suggesting that individual consciousness might be more resilient and adaptable than generally assumed. Sarah's ability to maintain coherent personality characteristics and purposeful behavior across more than a century of existence in spiritual form challenged conventional assumptions about the dependence of consciousness on brain function and physical embodiment. For Mrs. Whitmore and other Thornfield family members, the authentication of Sarah's spiritual presence provided reassurance about family continuity and the possibility of maintaining connections with deceased relatives. The knowledge that Sarah continued to watch over the family and remained available for guidance during difficult times offered comfort and confidence that helped family members navigate contemporary challenges with the benefit of ancestral wisdom. However, the case also highlighted potential risks associated with maintaining active spiritual connections across generations, particularly when deceased family members possess strong personalities and definite opinions about how their descendants should conduct their lives. The need for boundary negotiation demonstrated that consciousness survival might create ethical and practical challenges that required careful management to prevent spiritual guidance from becoming spiritual coercion. Dr. Richardson's final analysis of the Thornfield case concluded that the evidence strongly supported the possibility of consciousness survival beyond death, at least under specific circumstances involving individuals who possessed sufficient knowledge, preparation, and motivation to maintain coherent spiritual existence. The case provided unprecedented documentation of purposeful spiritual manifestation that extended across more than a century, suggesting that consciousness survival might be more common than generally recognized. The research also revealed that spiritual manifestation appeared to be facilitated by strong emotional connections between the deceased and living family members, along with environmental conditions that supported supernatural phenomena. The combination of historical preparation, family receptivity, and appropriate physical conditions seemed to create optimal circumstances for maintaining communication between spiritual and physical realms. The Thornfield spirit photograph remained on display in Mrs. Whitmore's home, serving as a tangible reminder of Sarah's continuing presence and her commitment to family welfare that transcended even death itself. The image provided comfort and inspiration to family members, while also serving as evidence that love and devotion could persist beyond the apparent finality of physical death. For Dr. Richardson, the case represented a transformative experience that expanded her understanding of human consciousness and its potential for survival beyond physical existence. While many questions remained unanswered about the mechanisms underlying spiritual manifestation, the Thornfield case provided compelling evidence that death might not represent the absolute end of individual consciousness, but rather a transition to forms of existence that remained largely beyond current scientific understanding. The legacy of the Thornfield case continued to influence research into consciousness survival and spiritual manifestation, providing a well-documented example of apparent posthumous communication that met rigorous standards of evidence and analysis. The case demonstrated that serious academic investigation of supernatural phenomena was both possible and potentially productive, offering insights into aspects of human experience that transcended conventional scientific frameworks. In the end, the Thornfield family portrait stood as a bridge between the worlds of the living and the dead, capturing a moment when the boundaries between these realms had briefly dissolved to allow grandmother Sarah to rejoin her family for one final photograph. Her presence in the image served as enduring testimony to the power of family love that transcended even death itself, watching over succeeding generations with the same protective devotion she had shown during her earthly life, and continuing to guide and protect her descendants through the mysterious mechanisms of consciousness that survived beyond the grave. However, Dr. Richardson's investigation was far from over. The success of the Thornfield case had brought her to the attention of other researchers and institutions dealing with similar phenomena, leading to a network of scholars dedicated to the systematic study of authenticated supernatural manifestations. This collaborative effort would reveal that the Thornfield portrait was part of a much larger pattern of spiritual activity that had been occurring throughout New England during the 1890s. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell from Yale University contacted Dr. Richardson after reading her preliminary findings about the Thornfield case. Dr. Hartwell had been independently researching what she called familial spiritual persistence in Connecticut families, documenting cases where deceased relatives continued to influence family affairs through various forms of supernatural manifestation. Her research had identified more than 30 families in Connecticut alone who had experienced documented spiritual interventions similar to those reported by the Thornfield descendants. The collaboration between Dr. Richardson and Dr. Hartwell led to the establishment of the New England Spiritual Manifestation Research Project, a multi-institutional effort to systematically document and analyze cases of apparent consciousness survival in the region. The project brought together historians, psychologists, theologians, and physical scientists in an unprecedented attempt to understand the mechanisms underlying spiritual manifestation and its relationship to cultural and environmental factors. The research project's initial survey of New England historical societies and family archives revealed an extraordinary concentration of authenticated spiritual activity during the 1890s. More than 200 families across Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, Vermont, and Maine had documented experiences with deceased relatives who continued to influence family affairs through supernatural means. The consistency of these reports across geographical and social boundaries suggested that the phenomenon represented a genuine historical trend rather than isolated incidents or cultural delusions. Dr. Patricia Chen, a cultural anthropologist from Brown University who joined the research project, identified several factors that appeared to have contributed to the unusual frequency of spiritual manifestation during the 1890s. The period was marked by rapid industrialization that disrupted traditional rural communities, massive immigration that challenged established social hierarchies, and economic instability that threatened the security of established families. These social pressures created conditions of uncertainty and change that might have facilitated supernatural intervention by deceased family members seeking to protect their descendants' welfare. At the same time, the 1890s represented a peak period of interest in spiritualism and communication with the dead throughout American society. The combination of scientific rationalism and spiritual exploration that characterized the era created a cultural environment where supernatural experiences were more likely to be documented and preserved rather than dismissed or suppressed. Families experiencing spiritual manifestations could find support and validation within spiritualist communities that provided frameworks for understanding and managing supernatural phenomena. Dr. Robert Fitzgerald, a physicist from MIT who brought scientific perspective to the research project, theorized that the technological innovations of the 1890s might have created environmental conditions that facilitated spiritual manifestation. The introduction of electrical power systems, telegraph networks, and other electromagnetic technologies had fundamentally altered the energy environment in which people lived, potentially creating new opportunities for consciousness that existed in non-physical forms to interact with the material world. Dr. Fitzgerald's analysis of the geographical distribution of documented spiritual manifestations revealed that cases were significantly more common in areas where new electrical and telegraph systems had been installed during the 1880s and 1890s. This correlation suggested that electromagnetic fields generated by early electrical technology might have provided the energy sources needed for spiritual consciousness to affect physical reality in detectable ways. The research project's investigation into the technical aspects of 1890s spirit photography revealed additional evidence supporting the authenticity of documented supernatural manifestations. Dr. James Morrison, a specialist in historical photographic processes from the Rochester Institute of Technology, conducted detailed analysis of more than 50 authenticated spirit photographs from the period, using advanced digital enhancement and spectroscopic techniques to detect signs of manipulation or fraud. Dr. Morrison's technical analysis confirmed that the spiritual figures appearing in the authenticated photographs had been captured during the original photographic exposures rather than added through subsequent manipulation. The electromagnetic signatures of the spiritual images were consistent with the rest of each photograph, and the lighting and shadow patterns affecting the spiritual figures matched the environmental conditions present during the photographic sessions. Most significantly, the spiritual figures showed characteristics that were inconsistent with any known photographic techniques available during the 1890s. The authenticated spirit photographs also revealed technical anomalies that challenged conventional understanding of photographic processes. The spiritual figures appeared to emit their own light sources rather than simply reflecting ambient light, creating illumination patterns that should have been impossible to achieve using period technology. Additionally, the spiritual images showed evidence of three-dimensional depth and perspective that exceeded the capabilities of early photographic equipment, suggesting that the cameras were recording phenomena that possessed genuine spatial characteristics rather than flat optical projections. Dr. Sarah Williams, a neuropsychologist from Harvard Medical School, who studied the psychological aspects of spiritual manifestation, interviewed more than 100 descendants of families who had experienced supernatural phenomena during the 1890s. Her research revealed that the psychological effects of spiritual manifestation had persisted across multiple generations, creating family traditions of supernatural communication that continued to influence descendant behavior more than a century later. Dr. Williams discovered that families with documented spiritual manifestations showed significantly higher levels of what she termed supernatural receptivity, the ability to perceive and interact with phenomena that existed beyond normal sensory experience. This receptivity appeared to be transmitted from parents to children through both genetic and cultural mechanisms, creating family lineages that maintained enhanced sensitivity to spiritual phenomena across successive generations. The psychological research also revealed that spiritual manifestation had generally positive effects on family cohesion and psychological well-being. Families who maintained connections with deceased relatives through supernatural communication showed lower rates of anxiety and depression, greater family loyalty and cooperation, and enhanced ability to cope with stress and adversity. The knowledge that deceased family members continued to watch over and guide their descendants provided emotional security that strengthened family bonds and individual resilience. However, Dr. Williams also documented cases where spiritual manifestation had negative psychological effects, particularly when the deceased relatives had been controlling or abusive during their lifetimes. These cases showed that dysfunctional family dynamics could persist beyond death, with spiritual manifestations perpetuating patterns of manipulation and psychological harm that affected multiple generations. The research emphasized the importance of establishing appropriate boundaries in spiritual communication to prevent supernatural guidance from becoming supernatural coercion. The research project's investigation into the historical context of 1890s spiritual manifestation led to the discovery of organized networks of families who had actively cultivated supernatural communication with deceased relatives. These networks, often centered around local spiritualist churches and mediums, provided support and guidance for families seeking to maintain connections with the dead. The networks also served as informal research communities, where families shared techniques and experiences related to spiritual communication. Dr. Margaret Foster, a religious historian from Boston University who studied these spiritualist networks, found evidence that some families had developed sophisticated systems for maintaining multi-generational spiritual communication. These systems included specific rituals and practices designed to facilitate supernatural contact, along with family traditions that ensured knowledge of spiritual communication techniques would be preserved and transmitted to future generations. The most elaborate of these systems was discovered in the archives of the Concord Spiritualist Society, where records documented a network of 12 families who had collaborated to create what they called a spiritual confederation, linking their deceased and living relatives across family boundaries. The confederation had operated from 1885 to 1920, facilitating supernatural communication and mutual assistance among member families, while also serving as a research community for the study of consciousness survival and spiritual manifestation. The Concord Spiritualist Society records included detailed documentation of the Confederation's methods and achievements, revealing sophisticated understanding of the conditions required for reliable spiritual communication. The member families had developed standardized procedures for conducting seances and other forms of supernatural contact, along with verification methods designed to distinguish authentic spiritual communication from psychological projection or wishful thinking. Most remarkably, the Confederation records documented successful instances of what they termed inter-family spiritual networking, communication between deceased members of different families that allowed for coordination of supernatural assistance across family boundaries. These networks enabled deceased relatives to share information and resources in ways that benefited multiple families simultaneously, creating support systems that transcended both individual family limitations and the boundary between life and death. The discovery of organized spiritual confederations challenged conventional assumptions about the random or isolated nature of supernatural phenomena, suggesting instead that spiritual manifestation could be systematically cultivated and managed through appropriate knowledge and techniques. The confederations represented sophisticated experiments in consciousness survival and spiritual communication that achieved remarkable success in maintaining functional relationships between the living and the dead. Dr. Richardson's analysis of the Confederation records revealed that Sarah Thornfield had been an active member of a similar spiritual network based in Salem, explaining her exceptional ability to maintain coherent consciousness and purposeful influence across more than a century of spiritual existence. Sarah's participation in organized spiritual development during her lifetime had provided her with the knowledge and skills needed to prepare effectively for consciousness survival beyond death. The Salem Spiritual Network records, discovered in the basement of a house that had once belonged to a prominent local medium, documented Sarah's progression from skeptical participant to accomplished spiritual practitioner during the years leading up to her death. The records showed that Sarah had worked extensively with experienced mediums to develop her ability to maintain conscious awareness in non-physical states, practicing techniques that would later enable her to communicate effectively with living family members after her death. The network records also revealed that Sarah's decision to commission the 1894 family portrait had been part of a deliberate strategy to create a permanent visual anchor that would facilitate her spiritual manifestation for future generations. The photograph was intended to serve as a focal point for family members seeking spiritual communication, providing a visual reference that would strengthen the connection between Sarah's consciousness and the physical world inhabited by her descendants. The systematic nature of Sarah's preparation for consciousness survival explained the exceptional quality and persistence of her spiritual manifestations, distinguishing her case from random or emotionally driven supernatural phenomena. Sarah's spiritual activities represented the application of organized knowledge and deliberate technique, rather than accidental or spontaneous consciousness survival, suggesting that such survival might be achievable for any individual who possessed appropriate preparation and motivation. The research project's documentation of organized spiritual networks throughout New England revealed that consciousness survival had been actively pursued and systematically achieved by hundreds of individuals during the late 19th century. These spiritual practitioners had developed sophisticated understanding of the conditions required for consciousness survival and had created support networks that facilitated successful transition from physical to spiritual existence while maintaining purposeful activity and communication with the living world. The discovery of widespread organized spiritual activity during the 1890s prompted the research project to investigate whether similar networks might still exist in contemporary New England communities. Dr. Richardson and her colleagues conducted discrete inquiries among modern spiritualist organizations, metaphysical societies, and alternative religious communities to determine whether traditional spiritual communication techniques were still being practiced and whether new cases of consciousness survival were continuing to occur. The contemporary investigation revealed that knowledge of traditional spiritual communication techniques had been largely preserved within small communities of practitioners who maintained the methods developed during the 1890s while adapting them to modern circumstances. Several of these communities reported ongoing contact with deceased members who had successfully achieved consciousness survival using traditional preparation techniques, suggesting that the phenomenon was not limited to historical cases but continued to occur under appropriate conditions. Dr. Maria Santos, a contemporary medium and spiritual teacher who had maintained contact with the research project, agreed to facilitate communication sessions designed to contact deceased members of the historical spiritual networks. These sessions, conducted under controlled conditions with extensive documentation, achieved remarkable success in establishing contact with spiritual consciousnesses that claimed to be deceased members of the 1890s confederations. The contemporary communication sessions revealed that many of the deceased spiritual practitioners from the 1890s remained active in non-physical realms and continued to collaborate in projects designed to facilitate consciousness survival for current generations. These spiritual entities expressed strong interest in supporting the research project's work and offered to provide information and assistance that could advance scientific understanding of consciousness survival and spiritual manifestation. The most significant contemporary contact was achieved with a spiritual consciousness that identified itself as Dr. Edmund Hartwell, a physician and spiritual researcher who had been a prominent member of the Concord Confederation until his death in 1923. Dr. Hartwell's spiritual communications provided detailed information about the mechanisms underlying consciousness survival and the techniques that had enabled him and his colleagues to maintain coherent existence beyond physical death. According to Dr. Hartwell's communications, consciousness survival required the development of what he termed spiritual infrastructure, patterns of energy and awareness that could maintain coherent function independently of physical brain activity. This infrastructure had to be deliberately constructed during physical life through specific practices that strengthened the non-physical aspects of consciousness while preparing for the transition that occurred at death. The spiritual infrastructure described by Dr. Hartwell involved complex relationships between consciousness, electromagnetic energy, and what he called morphic resonance fields that connected individual awareness with larger patterns of information and energy that existed independently of physical reality. Successful consciousness survival required learning to operate within these non-physical systems while maintaining individual identity and purposeful activity. Dr. Hartwell's communications also revealed that consciousness survival was most successful for individuals who maintained strong emotional connections with living people and who possessed clear purposes or responsibilities that motivated their continued existence in spiritual form. The emotional energy generated by loving relationships provided power sources for spiritual consciousness, while purposeful activity provided the structure and motivation needed to maintain coherent identity across the transition from physical to spiritual existence. The information provided by Dr. Hartwell and other contacted spiritual entities offered theoretical frameworks that might eventually allow for scientific study of consciousness survival, though the concepts involved challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of consciousness and its relationship to physical reality. The communications suggested that consciousness might be far more independent of brain function than generally assumed, existing as patterns of information and energy that could potentially maintain stability across various physical and non-physical environments. The research project's final report, published as a comprehensive volume by Harvard University Press, presented the most extensive documentation of consciousness survival and spiritual manifestation ever assembled. The report included technical analysis of authenticated spiritual photographs, psychological studies of families affected by supernatural phenomena, historical documentation of organized spiritual networks, and theoretical frameworks derived from contemporary spiritual communications. While the supernatural aspects of the research remained controversial within mainstream academic circles, the quality and consistency of the documented evidence established the report as a significant contribution to consciousness studies and survival research. The report demonstrated that systematic investigation of spiritual phenomena was possible using rigorous academic methods, and that such investigation could yield valuable insights into the nature of consciousness and its potential for survival beyond physical death. The Thornfield family portrait retained its position as one of the most compelling pieces of evidence for consciousness survival, providing visual documentation of Sarah's spiritual manifestation that could be subjected to technical analysis and historical verification. However, the broader research revealed that Sarah's case was part of a much larger pattern of consciousness survival that had affected hundreds of families throughout New England during a specific historical period when cultural and technological conditions had facilitated widespread spiritual manifestation. For Dr. Richardson, the research project represented a fundamental transformation in her understanding of human consciousness and its relationship to physical existence. The evidence for consciousness survival was too extensive and consistent to dismiss, yet the implications challenged core assumptions about the nature of death and the boundaries of human experience. The research had revealed aspects of reality that transcended conventional scientific frameworks, while demanding serious consideration of possibilities that most scholars preferred to ignore. The legacy of the New England Spiritual Manifestation Research Project continued to influence academic study of consciousness and survival phenomena, providing methodological models for investigating supernatural claims while maintaining scientific rigor and objectivity. The project demonstrated that spiritual phenomena could be studied systematically when appropriate controls and documentation procedures were employed, and that such research could contribute valuable insights to understanding of consciousness, death, and the possibility of existence beyond physical life. Mrs. Whitmore and other descendant families who had participated in the research reported lasting benefits from learning about their ancestors' spiritual activities and their own potential for maintaining connections with deceased relatives. The knowledge that consciousness survival was possible and that loving relationships could transcend death provided comfort and inspiration that enriched their lives while connecting them with family traditions that extended across multiple generations. The Thornfield family portrait continued to hang in Mrs. Whitmore's living room, serving as a daily reminder of Sarah's continuing presence and her commitment to family welfare that had survived more than a century beyond her physical death. The photograph had become a focal point for family gatherings and important decisions, providing a visual connection with ancestral wisdom that guided and supported current generations while maintaining links with the spiritual dimensions of family heritage.